The disrespect has officially arrived, and if you're a Detroit Lions fan, this might end up being the best thing that could have happened before the 2026 season even begins. Every year there is at least one ranking that sparks debate across the NFL, but this one goes beyond disagreement. It raises a serious question about how people are evaluating one of the most consistent quarterbacks in football. A recent quarterback ranking placed Jared Goff all the way down at number 16 entering the 2026 season, and honestly, it's difficult to understand how anyone looking at the last 3 years of football could reach that conclusion. Think about what Jared Goff has accomplished. We are not talking about a quarterback who had one lucky season or benefited from a hot streak. We are talking about a player who has been mentioned as an MVP candidate during each of the last 3 seasons. Not simply among quarterbacks, but among the most valuable players in the entire league. Year after year, he has finished near the top of the NFL in virtually every major passing statistic, and he has done it while leading one of the league's most productive offenses. What makes the ranking even more surprising is that last season was far from easy. The offensive line dealt with challenges, yet Goff still managed to produce one of the strongest statistical seasons of his career. Instead of falling apart when circumstances became more difficult, he continued to execute the offense at a high level. That is usually the kind of consistency analysts reward. Instead, somehow, he was pushed outside the top half of starting quarterbacks. And once you begin looking at some of the names ranked ahead of him, the questions only become louder. Trevor Lawrence appears ahead of Jared Goff despite never putting together multiple seasons of elite production. Jaden Daniels had an impressive rookie campaign but barely played last year. Caleb Williams also landed ahead of Goff, despite Goff defeating him twice during last season. Sam Darnold is another quarterback ranked higher, creating even more confusion about the criteria being used. At that point, it becomes less about individual opinions and more about whether consistent production is actually being valued. Even Jordan Love became part of the discussion. There is respect for his talent, but many observers continue to wonder exactly why he receives so much national praise while Goff continues to be questioned. Love certainly has athletic ability and can make impressive throws, but there are still concerns about his timing and decision-making within the structure of an offense. There are moments when he holds the football just a little too long, allowing passing windows to disappear before delivering the ball. That is one area where Jared Goff separates himself. His game has never been built around improvisation or spectacular off-script highlights. Instead, his strength comes from recognizing defensive coverages before the snap, processing information quickly, and delivering the football exactly when the play is designed to succeed. It may not always generate viral highlights, but it consistently generates first downs, scoring drives, and victories. One comparison made during the discussion may surprise some people, but it actually explains Goff's style remarkably well. Mentally, the closest comparison many have seen since Tom Brady retired is Jared Goff. That does not mean the accomplishments are identical. Brady's championships speak for themselves. But when you focus strictly on how they process defenses, how they operate within the pocket, and how surgically they execute an offensive system, there are undeniable similarities. Patrick Mahomes wins with creativity and improvisation. Other elite quarterbacks rely heavily on extending plays outside the pocket. Jared Goff wins differently. His greatest weapon is making the correct decision before defenders even have time to react. He reads the defense, trusts his protection, releases the football on time, and keeps the offense on schedule. That style rarely receives the same attention because it is almost invisible when executed correctly. Fans notice spectacular scrambling plays or impossible throws across the body. They do not always appreciate perfect timing, anticipation, and decision-making because those qualities simply make difficult plays appear routine. Perhaps that is exactly why the respect continues to lag behind the production. Some believe the missing ingredient is a Super Bowl championship. Until Goff wins one, there will always be critics who refuse to place him among the league's elite quarterbacks regardless of what the numbers say. Fair or unfair, championships often become the final measuring stick in these conversations. Ironically, this kind of national doubt may actually work in Detroit's favor. The Lions have often played their best football when expectations were lower and outside respect was limited. During their rise over the past several seasons, they thrived while proving people wrong every single week. As national attention increased, expectations changed. Now, with rankings like this suggesting Detroit's quarterback is only the 16th best starter in football, that familiar underdog mentality may be returning. There is another interesting angle to all of this as well.
If
If the coaching staff truly believes in Goff's ability to control games through the air, could Detroit become even more aggressive with its passing attack this season, rather than relying on a run-heavy approach every week? There is growing discussion about allowing Goff to throw a few more passes each game. Even adding 5 additional passing attempts could significantly change how defenses prepare for Detroit. With explosive playmakers surrounding him, putting the ball in Goff's hands more frequently could create even greater opportunities for the offense to stay among the NFL's elite. At the same time, that approach could also help maximize the talents of Jahmyr Gibbs by getting him involved more as a receiver instead of asking him to absorb unnecessary punishment and pass protection. His receiving ability has already become one of the most dangerous parts of Detroit's offense, and expanding that role even further could create matchup nightmares for opposing defenses. The bigger picture remains simple. Jared Goff continues to produce at an elite level, yet many outside Detroit still hesitate to recognize him among the NFL's very best quarterbacks. If history has taught Lions fans anything, it's that this team often responds best when people underestimate them. So after seeing Jared Goff ranked only 16th among NFL starting quarterbacks entering the 2026 season, do you believe this disrespect will motivate the Lions even more? Or do you think the national perception of Goff will finally change only if Detroit wins the Super Bowl? And that possibility becomes even more interesting when you start looking beyond the rankings and focus on how Detroit's offense could actually evolve this season. The conversation is no longer simply about defending Jared Goff from criticism. It's about asking whether the Lions are preparing to unlock another level offensively, one that makes this unit even more dangerous than it has been over the last few years. One of the biggest discussions surrounding Detroit right now is whether the offense should lean more heavily into Goff's strengths by throwing the football more frequently, not because the running game has failed, far from it. The Lions have built one of the league's most physical rushing attacks, and that identity has become part of who they are. But when you have a quarterback who consistently diagnoses defenses before the snap and distributes the football with remarkable efficiency, there is a strong argument that the offense should trust him even more. Imagine the impact if those rushing attempts were slightly reduced without abandoning the physical identity that has made Detroit successful. Instead of forcing the ground game on every series, the offense could simply allow Goff to attempt a few more passes each week. 5 additional throws may not sound significant, but over the course of an entire season, that represents dozens of extra opportunities to exploit favorable matchups and keep opposing defenses guessing. It also changes the way defenses have to prepare. When opponents know Detroit is committed to pounding the football, they naturally devote additional resources to slowing down the running game. But if Goff is given greater freedom to attack early through the air, defensive coordinators suddenly have a much more difficult puzzle to solve. They cannot simply crowd the line of scrimmage. They have to respect the passing game from the opening drive, and that creates more space for everyone else on the field. That brings another player into the conversation who could become even more dangerous. Jahmyr Gibbs has already established himself as one of the NFL's most explosive offensive weapons. His ability to turn short touches into game-changing plays forces every defense to account for him on every snap. But there is growing belief that Detroit can maximize his value even further by changing how he is used. Instead of asking Gibbs to spend valuable snaps absorbing contact and pass protection, why not turn him into an even bigger receiving threat? The numbers already show how productive he has been catching the football. Since entering the league, he has become one of the NFL's leading running backs in receptions, placing among the very best at his position. That is not an accident. It reflects his ability to separate from linebackers, create mismatches in space, and punish defenses whenever they lose track of him. Now imagine linebackers facing an impossible decision. If they blitz, Gibbs slips out into open space with room to operate. If they stay home to cover him, Goff has additional time to survey the field. Either way, Detroit creates an advantage simply by putting one of its most explosive athletes in motion, rather than leaving him stationary in the backfield, waiting to block an incoming defender. There is also another reason this approach makes sense. The Lions understand exactly how valuable Gibbs is to their offense. Every unnecessary collision is one more opportunity for injury, and protecting one of the team's biggest playmakers over the course of a long season becomes increasingly important. Keeping him involved as a receiver instead of exposing him to repeated hits and pass protection may ultimately help preserve his explosiveness when Detroit needs it most later in the year. Meanwhile, the backfield appears well positioned to handle those physical responsibilities. With additional depth available, there is confidence that other running backs can absorb many of the blocking blocking assignments and complementary rushing attempts. That allows Gibbs to remain exactly what makes him special, an offensive weapon capable of changing a game every time he touches the football. As exciting as the offensive conversation is, another storyline continues to develop on the defensive side. Terrion Arnold recently cleared waivers, meaning no team claimed him during that process. While that does not immediately resolve his situation, it officially opens the possibility for him to sign elsewhere in the future depending on how everything unfolds. That immediately sparked another debate among Lions fans. History has shown that when talented players become available following off-field situations, there are always organizations willing to take a chance if they believe the talent outweighs the risk. Detroit has experienced similar situations before, watching players depart only to quickly receive opportunities with other franchises under different circumstances. That reality creates understandable frustration. Supporters naturally wonder why one organization is forced to move on while another may eventually benefit from acquiring the same player at a much lower cost. It is one of the stranger realities of the NFL, where timing, contract situations, and organizational philosophies often determine how these cases play out. For now, though, there appears to be little expectation that anything happens immediately. With legal matters still ongoing, many around the league may simply choose to wait until the process reaches its conclusion before making any decisions. That approach avoids unnecessary distractions while allowing